colocar un ejemplo a partir de la experiencia que uno tiene de andar en la selva.
I'd perhaps like to share with you an example of something that I've lived and that one would live if one was in a jungle environment.
En la selva existe una planta que cuando uno pasa alrededor de ella pierde el sentido de la orientación.
In the rainforest, there's a plant where if you are in its vicinity, if you walk close to it, you lose your sense of direction, your sense of orientation.
Y siempre uno se propone, voy a salir de aquí, y vuelve a caer al mismo punto.
And you keep telling yourself, if I just keep trying, I'm going to get out and find my way back to where I was going. But you always end up circling back to this plant.
Yo diría que la sociedad y los poderosos les está pasando lo mismo. Son conscientes de que algo está mal, que el modelo de desarrollo, el modelo económico los lleva al mismo punto, no logran salir de allí. O sea, son conscientes de eso, pero no salen de allí.
I feel like our societies, our cultures, and even the most powerful in our societies are sometimes aware of the fact that our economic model, our development model is a broken one, but they can't seem to find their way out and always just circle back to try to true what has always been done, the way it's always been done.
Es necesario romper paradigmas en la relación entre los pueblos, en las relaciones internacionales y en la relación con la misma naturaleza.
And so we need to break away from the old paradigms when it comes to relationships between peoples, between nations, how we conduct international relations, and also our relationship to nature itself.
Por eso no es posible responder de ellos esa pregunta de él.
And that's why it's so difficult to answer your question about the macro picture.
Pero sí hay pueblos o hay estados que por lo menos en términos legales han avanzado en reconocer los derechos de la madre naturaleza.
But we can say that there are some peoples and even some states that have made some advances when it comes to recognition of the rights of Mother Earth or nature.
Reconocer el derecho de la madre naturaleza implica una relación distinta.
Recognizing the rights of Mother Earth means creating a new relationship.
Y es decir, que la extracción de recursos naturales, el desarrollo mismo, tiene un límite.
And that also means recognizing that resource extraction and economic development, resources themselves are finite and extraction has a limit.
Pero eso es muy difícil cambiar si, por ejemplo, se prohíbe a los científicos, a los investigadores utilizar términos como cambio climático.
But this is very difficult to do in an environment where we muzzle and silence scientists and tell them they can't use words like climate change.
Es muy difícil.
It's very difficult.
Y sabemos que eso ya está ocurriendo.
And we know this is happening in many places.
De otro lado, quiero señalar que responsabilidad corporativa, a mi juicio, es una categoría impulsada desde Naciones Unidas y las empresas para no aceptar que deben de ser sujetos del derecho internacional.
And I'd also like to say that, at least to the extent that I've observed it, the idea, the concept of corporate social responsibility is one that has been very much proposed and brought to the fore by the UN, by companies themselves, by the private sector, by different actors, precisely as a way to not have to respect various obligations under international treaties that nations have already signed on to and that they should already be respecting.
Es necesario que en el orden internacional se establezcan responsabilidades respecto del genocidio, respecto el deterioro ambiental como una responsabilidad jurídica.
So we need to live in a world where we develop norms and laws at the international level around genocide, around environmental destruction that actually have legal teeth.
Porque la responsabilidad corporativa los informes de responsabilidad corporativa lo que pueden conllevar es a maquillar la verdadera realidad.
Because too often what happens within a framework of corporate social responsibility is a sort of a glossing over and a masking of what's the rights that are really being violated or the agreements that are really not being respected.
Las empresas, como los estados, lo primero que tendrían que informar debiera de ser cómo están aplicando el derecho. Responsabilidad corporativa debiera ser algo adicional, un plus, más allá.
So CSR should be like a bonus, like a plus, the icing on the top, after governments ensure that they are, in fact, respecting the treaties that they've signed.
Pero lo que observamos es lo contrario.
What we see is the opposite.
Las acciones de responsabilidad corporativa ocultando la verdadera violación a los derechos fundamentales de los pueblos.
We see corporate social responsibility used as a discourse to sort of mask what's really going on beneath.
Y voy a colocar un ejemplo de una empresa de carbón llamada Cerrejón en la Guajira colombiana.
And I'd just like to give you one example of a coal company in the Guajira region in Colombia.
A ella presenta informes, tiene una propaganda que dice: Cerrejón, carbón para el mundo, riqueza para el país.
They have a slogan, corporate propaganda, that says, Cerrejón, coal for the world, wealth for the nation.
Y yo digo que le falta una I que diga, y pobreza para los guayú, para los indígenas guayú.
But I think there should be an ending to this slogan, which is end poverty for the guayú, for the people where they operate.
Porque si usted va a esa región, efectivamente ve que Cerrejón ha hecho unas escuelitas, parecen más gallineros que escuela.
Because if you go to that region, in fact, you will see that the company has built some schools. They look more like chicken coops than schools, but they're schools.
Ha colocado unos tanquecitos de agua.
They've built a few little sort of rickety water tanks.
Ha construido unos pequeños centros de salud.
They've built a few small health clinics.
Pero no hay médico, no hay agua.
But there's no doctor, there's no running water.
Y los animales de los cuales proveen la alimentación los guayú, todos están contaminados por el carbón.
And all the animals that the guayú rely on for their subsistence have all been contaminated and made ill by the various contaminants used in the coal mining process.
El nivel de desnutrición, de enfermedades y de contaminación ambiental es muy alto en esa región.
The level of malnutrition, of sickness related to pollution caused by the mining is very high in this area.
Entonces nosotros lo que cuestionamos es ¿por qué si generan riqueza y desarrollo los principales beneficiarios, si fuéramos a hablar de beneficio del verdadero desarrollo y el crecimiento económico, no son los guayú, de donde se saca el recurso natural? Esa es la gran contradicción.
Our analysis and our big question for that model is, how is it that this company that is producing such great wealth produces no wealth for the people in the region where where this extraction is taking place?
Lo que se hace en el marco de la responsabilidad corporativa pareciera más una cuestión caritativa que derecho, porque la gente sigue siendo mucho más pobre.
So what's done in the name of corporate social responsibility, the building of this clinic and the water tanks and so on, is done really in a spirit of charity and not in a spirit of the respect for the rule of law.
No es que esté en contra de la responsabilidad corporativa.
I'm not saying here that I'm
Pero
against
no puede
CSR,
suplir el derecho.
but it can't replace the rule of law.
De otro lado, quisiera decir que pues hay diferencia, hay empresas que tienen mayor nivel de diálogo con los pueblos indígenas.
On another point, I would like to say that there are some companies, to answer one of the questions, that have had more engagement or more dialogue with some of the indigenous peoples.
Pero la regla es que todas deben de cumplir el derecho a la consulta, el diálogo, el respeto a la población y no afectar el medio ambiente.
Sí. Y pero, ¿qué es el final?
No, que deben de respetar el medio ambiente.
Y no lo hacen.
Sí, no lo hacen.
But in fact, what they really should be doing in terms of seeking free, prior, informed consent, in terms of genuine dialogue and consultation with indigenous peoples and respect for their rights, does not happen.
Y nos preocupa porque, como lo dije al principio, en el caso colombiano lo que se quiere es hacer reformas a los códigos, a la legislación ambiental, de tal manera que ese no sea un problema para la ejecución o la puesta en marcha de un proyecto minero, o mejor, un proyecto extractivo de recursos naturales.
And this is a great concern to us, because now what we're seeing in Colombia is a reform of environmental legislation, for example, that in fact makes it easier, that has as its aim, this reform, not to strengthen environmental protection, but in fact to make it easier for companies to have access to certain territories and resources.
Okay, in the interest of time, I wanted to also give a couple of comments to our last person who spoke about Canada's endorsement of the Declaration, but we are running out of time, so I'm just going to say very briefly, because that's something that I've worked on quite a lot, is that Canada's endorsement of the Declaration was essentially a public relations exercise, but they've also, they're trying to put out a public statement saying that the way that Canada engages with international law can be terms that they set. Which is totally ridiculous, and it isn't how international law works. And the whole point of having international law is to raise domestic standards. So that's an ongoing challenge that we have with the federal administration and its interaction with international human rights. And I'd be happy to talk to you more about that later if you want. I think one of the things that we wanted to do today, and I hope that you will agree that we did, is show you that some of these challenges that Indigenous peoples are facing in Canada are similar and echoing challenges that Indigenous peoples are facing in Colombia. And so you can see that this is a context that is global in nature, and that in our push for resources, which is about economics, it most often, on a global level, it's Indigenous peoples that are having a very negative effect in their communities, and that we do have responsibilities to be aware of that and to act on that. And it is partly holding our governments to account, and engaging with corporations. That's an element of it. Amnesty has some action items that follow up on that, which some are at the front of this room, which you're welcome to take. But I think we also wanted for you to see that these pieces, what it really does come down to is, it's not about policy reform or legislative reform really, it's about implementing the existing human rights standards that we already have. And a system that the international community has already agreed to and set those standards, and now let's see them implemented. And I will also just say before we close, and when we have some refreshments, and people are welcome to stay if they want to ask individual questions of either of our panelists. We have the room till 5, so you're welcome to stay and help yourself to refreshments, but also for further conversation and to look at the materials we have here. I have 5 copies of a book that unfortunately I'm not at liberty to give away, but are for sale, that's on implementing the Declaration, realizing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Triumph, Hope, and Action. And it talks about the Declaration's development, its adoption, and now the push for implementation, and how we see that the push for implementation of the UN Declaration is, as a blueprint for reconciliation, is the kind of tools we can use both in Canada, in situations in Canada communities, also in Colombia.